terms of emission. And we thought it would be a great presentation for our budding new energy working group, which is one of the newer working groups under the New Hampshire Network umbrella. But it also seemed really, really relevant for the whole network. So we've decided to sort of make this the monthly flagship meeting. Chris has been very generous in working with us and has prepared a presentation and updated it from the initial presentation that he created. I asked Chris for a bio, but I don't know if I got one, and I also will let him fill in any blanks. But Chris currently works for Clean Energy New Hampshire, focusing on, I believe, building energy and legislative policy, and previously worked for the Department of Environmental Services for many, many years. And helped coordinate the prior climate action plan for the state. So that's a very useful experience to have in the context of the current priority climate action plan development. And a lot of what Chris is going to present today is actually going to be helpful in helping people input in strategic ways into that plan. So I think with that, I'll turn it over to you, Chris. And then I think we're aiming for about, what did we say, about a half hour, and then Q&A, 40 minutes, 90 minutes?
I do have until closer to 5:30 for my formal shut off. I know that everyone else signed up until 5. So I think one of the original presentation was an hour and a half, an hour of the presentation and a half hour of questions. I can actually dig up that original recording from the fall of 2019, or actually it was the fall of 2020. It's actually, I think, on my desktop because we had to make it in advance so people could watch it. And then we had 45 minutes of questions following that. I will also note that I am seeing that there's at least one New Hampshire DES staff who I won't call out, but if there are questions about the PCAP and they want to volunteer anything, we'll do that towards the end. My name is Chris Skoglund, as Gabrielle and Susan have mentioned. Prior, I worked for 14 years with the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services, was involved in the climate action plan, but then also did climate planning internally, and then worked with the New England states and Eastern Canadian provinces to develop a climate plan for them as well. A lot of my work was doing the greenhouse gas inventory and the energy inventory for the state, supporting the work of the Office of Energy and Planning, later OSI, the Office of Strategic Initiatives. 2 years ago, I transitioned to Clean Energy New Hampshire, and there I work at the PUC on regulatory matters, but also support our legislative work, and then am supporting 3 different initiatives. We have the Drive Electric New Hampshire initiative. We also have a clean energy working group, and there's a building energy group that we're hoping to stand up now that the Energy Efficiency and Sustainable Energy Board has been repealed. So my goal today is just to give you, I'm going to go ahead and try to share this, or I will share this. One other thing is I also am a classroom teacher, mostly middle school, but I teach at the University of New Hampshire. Happy to take any and all questions, but given the tight time that we have today, I'm going to ask that questions be held until the end, and then we'll focus in there. And then I'm happy to hold any and all questions. My email is here, and have discussions with everyone after. Are you able to see just my presentation? I'm not sure which screen you see. So
yes, we see your presentation as a presentation. It looks
okay,
great.
So just going to touch on really quickly what Clean Energy New Hampshire is. One of the things I want to do is just differentiate between the different terms of the way we use emissions, talk about trends in emissions, and then maybe a little bit of thoughts on changing course, but not really giving too much in terms of direction. The purpose of this presentation is really to kind of serve as a foundation for discussions that may happen at the legislature, may happen at the PUC, may happen with DES and the New Hampshire Listens team for their PCAP, and then eventually their comprehensive plan. So I work with Clean Energy New Hampshire. For those of you who don't know, I'm not going to go into too much detail. We work across a lot of different areas. Increasingly, we're trying to help build consensus and engagement across the state. We have circuit riders that we're also going to be bringing to the New Hampshire network and introducing them, because I know you have a lot of interest in local energy working groups. Our circuit riders support them. We have the policy team that you've heard about. We have a weekly call, but then we have me at the PUC. Nick Paul is our legislative director who works at the legislature, and then Sam Evans-Brown, formerly of NHPR, who is pretty much everywhere. I'm also working to be doing more analysis and reporting, some of which will overlap with what you see here today. So the key messages that I want to kind of have being taken away, and there are more slides that are actually hidden in this presentation. When we share it, you'll be able to look through, and I speak fast, so there's a lot of text, a lot of pictures. I will try to go at a measured pace, but I want to make sure I get through the entire story, and that's really what it is. Where we've had air and climate policies, New Hampshire's experienced an environmental as well as an economic benefit. But the policies that we've experienced or that have benefited us aren't all from New Hampshire. We're part of a regional market. Unfortunately, absent additional policies, we may not see further emissions reductions in the foreseeable future. But identifying or looking at the entire economy and the impact of external and internal policies and the way that they've played out may help you all identify how we can reduce statewide as well as localized emissions. I got a lot of questions that were sent to Susan and Gabrielle in advance of the presentation, and unfortunately, I will not answer most of them because today is really the beginning of a story and we have less than an hour. So this is going to be state level, high level, mostly focused on carbon dioxide, and I'll talk about why. It's going to have lots of stats and figures, but it won't be able to dig as much into the individual policies, specific health-related impacts, sorry, Matt Kaline, and won't look at the economic impacts. But what I see is this could identify what are additional questions this group wants to hear, and then perhaps we could, the Energy Committee can curate additional speakers who can come in and speak to, like, what are the branches off of this kind of tree trunk of a presentation. And the presentation was written in 2020 because there was broad use of the term emissions, but because I've worked at the air division for 14 years, I was actually able to pick up on the fact that people were conflating the two main types of pollutants that I work with or worked with. Criteria air pollutants, those that are in the Clean Air Act and have standards that are set in federal statute. And then there's greenhouse gas emissions, which mostly I will refer to as GHGs, but there can be both naturally occurring as well as man-made. They are more diffuse and have a global impact, where criteria pollutants will have a more localized impact directly on human health. Greenhouse gases tend to have an impact on our human health more indirectly. Now, when we look at criteria air pollutants, New Hampshire DES is overrun with programs that they manage in order to control those criteria air pollutants. And for that reason, we've seen most of the air pollutants fall by more than 90% in the state. So that we're trending well below the standards that have been set, ratcheting down over time as we've been kind of controlling more emissions from the economy. But when it comes to greenhouse gas programs, we really only have one, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. There is the RPS, and then there is the New Hampshire Saves Energy Efficiency Program, but those are not directly related to greenhouse gases or criteria air pollutants. They benefit both. So the things that support both criteria air pollutant reductions as well as greenhouse gas reductions, anything that has to do with energy efficiency, anything that has to do with expanding renewable energy generation in New Hampshire or the region. And then there's also strategic or beneficial electrification, electric cars, heat pumps. Those are also beneficial. So that's just a really quick dive into those. Criteria pollutants, these are, ozone. Ozone is great when it's up in the stratosphere, not so great when it's down here at ground level. Tropospheric ozone can burn our lungs, acts like bleach. Particulate pollution, things that come from, diesel engines that are not well regulated or wood stoves. They can get deep into our lungs and cause cancer. But then there's also carbon monoxide, nitrous dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and lead. Lead, not as much of a problem since the 70s. But all of these are things that we do have programs to regulate. Greenhouse gas programs, there's far less regulation concerning these, especially in New Hampshire. And so it's here we're going to focus because this is where we don't have as much regulation. It's worth noting that anything that we do to reduce ozone or black carbon does have a climate impact as well. So nothing kind of fits neatly in either category. Methane can actually contribute to ozone. And if you are interested in more about New Hampshire's air quality, I would direct you to these two resources, both of which I did contribute to and have an extensive amount of information on the Clean Air Act, all the different pollutants we're talking about or just mentioned in terms of those that are governed at the federal level, but it also talks about those in the greenhouse gas categories, but to a smaller degree. I want to thank the individual that put these forward. In the presentation, when I share it, it does have these live links. And these are pretty exhaustive resources that are updated about every 3 years, which means we should be due for another one soon. I have not had a chance to check with my former colleagues at DES to see if we will be seeing a 2023 or a 2024 update. So when we talk about, and one of the reasons why I do want to note that I'm focusing on greenhouse gases is not only because they're less controlled in New Hampshire, but it's also because, as I noted, if we control greenhouse gases, we can actually reduce all pollutants, but we do have the Priority Climate Action Plan that DES is looking to put together, but that is due to EPA in March. So while other pollutants are critical, the time is ripe for us to be thinking about what are priority areas for reducing emissions in New Hampshire. Most of the pollution comes from fossil fuel, so we'll focus here. Some does come from industrial processes, also biological processes, landfills and wastewater. And then there are other processes that off gas from agriculture, land use change, forestry. The forestry sector in New Hampshire actually is a net positive because our trees are still regrowing from the land clearing in prior centuries. If you're not familiar, the gases that contribute to climate change include not only carbon dioxide, and I know that for many of you, this is like, yeah, I know this. One of the things as a teacher, I want to make sure that everyone is on the same page when we get to the more advanced content at the second half of the presentation. But there's carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide. But we'll be focusing primarily on carbon dioxide. Throughout this, one of the things that I'm doing is fractionating into where is the biggest impact. Now, CO2 is really important because it can last in the atmosphere for thousands of years. The other gases that contribute to climate change that are released by New Hampshire's actions have a much shorter time frame. They may actually have, for those of you that are more conversant in all this, they do have a larger global warming impact, but they are a much smaller percentage of what is released by New Hampshire activity. So this is a pie chart that shows in 2018. So all of this is from the presentation that I had given and that was publicly available in 2020. I'm not sure that there's been an updated inventory with the data published yet. But we regularly were finding that more than 90% of our emissions were coming from fossil fuels. And a smaller portion was coming from other activities. And so when we look at them, it's not that 3% of our emissions were coming from PFCs and HFCs and sulfur hexafluoride. All of these gases are being directly compared to CO2. So it's an apples to apples comparison. Again, I could spend 2 slides explaining this, but for the sake of time, I have to skip ahead. Can come back or set up a time to explain in more detail. But CO2 is 90% of the problem that we are seeing in New Hampshire. Globally, many people have seen this. This shows the Keeling curve from 1958 to just last week. Carbon dioxide levels increasing in the atmosphere. This is carbon dioxide alone. To the layperson, this might not seem like a big deal because it's just a gentle slope. When we look out to I think this is the 1700s to 2023, we can see that after World War II, emissions really did begin to pick up. And that was when fossil fuel use cranked up, but the economies of many of the countries began to develop at a faster rate, including China, India, around the globe. And then there's the more famous view that shows that carbon dioxide has actually fluctuated quite violently throughout history. But when we look at it in comparison to historical levels, we are now at 421.5 parts per million as of last week, which puts us at a level that has not been seen in 3 million years. Prior to that, we had not been much above 300 parts per million at any point in history. Those peaks and valleys do map very closely, if not entirely accurately, with ice ages. That's a whole biogeochemical process that would require another presentation. The key takeaway, though, is while CO2 levels have moved up and down in the atmosphere throughout time, human activity has changed them in fundamentally different ways, or significantly. And then we are now seeing the temperature record begin to move up. And there has been a delay, however. What's interesting, for those of you that don't know, is that after World War II, when CO2 began to rise in the atmosphere, the temperature actually started to dip. And that was a result of coal-based pollution being dumped into the atmosphere that actually scattered light and sent it back into space and cooled the Earth, preventing the Earth from warming, even as CO2 was building in the atmosphere. Right around the time that I was born, it began to warm, and a lot of that has to do with the Clean Air Act and other regulatory efforts in other countries that did reduce the particulate pollution and the sulfate pollution that was going in the atmosphere as a consequence of coal-based energy generation. So this allowed the Earth to begin warm in an unmitigated fashion, and this past year is speculated to be the warmest year on record, largely as a result of El Nino. Again, a whole other presentation. The takeaway is that there is a lag between CO2 that's added to the atmosphere and what we are seeing go, what the temperature is on Earth. With that, we can now look at what is New Hampshire's contribution. And one of the things that triggered this presentation back in 2020 was multiple headlines around the country that were saying that New Hampshire was leading the way in greenhouse gas reductions. And as someone that had been working with all 6 New England states, 5 Canadian provinces, this didn't quite square. If you look at the image to the right, you can see that New Hampshire from 2005 to 2017 was noted as having a reduction of 37% reduction in CO2 emitted by the economy. This was just behind Maryland, which had 38% reduction, and just ahead of Maine, which had a 33% reduction. Now, these are big drops, but some of it had to do with the time series that they were looking at. And so don't worry about the bar chart to the right-hand side. It basically says the exact same thing, but when it got carried into the presentation, it eliminated the states that it was supposed to be talking about. So in looking at the data, one thing that we can see is that we actually have seen a greenhouse gas emission reduction since 2005. To explain this chart, this one takes a little bit more. The black line shows the growth in the state's GDP. So our economy has been growing since 1997, the first year the data was accurately reported. So I can't go back behind 1997 for this figure. And it compares everything starts at a 0 point. So the black line shows the economy has been growing. The green line shows that there has been a gentle increase in our population. Most of our population actually grew in the 1990s and then slowed after 2000, but it has been increasing and is nearly at 1.3 million people. The red line shows the greenhouse gas emission reductions, or greenhouse gas emissions, since 1997. And if you look at 2005 to 2021 or 2020, there has been a steep reduction in emissions over that time. But that is largely a consequence of even almost a equal increase between 1997 and 2004. So our emissions grew really, really quickly and then fell more gradually. So to some degree, we're getting credit for reduction below a large increase. If we look at our energy consumption, which is the blue line, you can see that our entire economy did see almost a 25% increase in energy consumption by 2004, but by 2020 it was, largely we were consuming just as much energy in 2020 as we were in 1997. So emissions have gone down, energy consumption has not, since the beginning of like this record. So somewhere in here, we've got those lies, damn lies, and statistics. So I'm going to skip this one. This just shows, I think this is actually a legacy slide that I had meant to hide for today, but it does show the goals that had been set in 2009. And it shows that when we look at our emissions, in 2009, the dotted line shows a goal pathway that we had set for ourselves in terms of where we wanted to be by 2050. We wanted to get to an 80% reduction by 2050. And the black line shows that between 2005 and 2020, we were actually trending below the goal line that had been set for New Hampshire. And we were well below what we thought we would be if our population and economy had continued to grow in the same way, relying on fossil fuels as they had before. So there is good news. We have lowered our greenhouse gas emissions, but they're almost the same level that they were in 1990. So we have kind of saw a drop and then stalled. The reason why we've seen the drop is very telling. And that requires us to dig deeper into the data. So what this image shows is all of the emissions for New Hampshire by sector. The one that stands out the most is blue. This is the transportation sector. Since 2004, the transportation sector has seen almost no change in its greenhouse gas emissions. The green line shows, or the green section, shows the residential sector. Light blue shows commercial, and gray shows industrial. What we see is that the building sector saw a dip in emissions. That's actually contemporaneous with the Great Recession, but since 2011, emissions in the building sector have actually risen out to 2018 for the most recent year that data is available. When we look at the electric sector, however, there is something that is definitely happening. There was a big increase between 2002 and 2004, and then between 2005 and 2018, we see that drop off. Almost all of the emission reductions that we have seen in New Hampshire in the past have been due to reductions in the electric sector. 74% of the greenhouse gas reductions over the past 2 decades occurred in the electric sector. All the other sectors did drop, but they have either remained flat or they're starting to rise since 2011, and we've begun to recover from the recession. So if we look at emissions that peak, or for each of the 2 years that that we had the data for, 2005 was the peak year. And the transportation sector at that time represented 30% or 33% of emissions. Exactly 1/4 of the total emissions that were going into the atmosphere. The electric sector was just over 1/3 at 35%, and the building sector represented an additional 30%, with agriculture and waste just 3%. In 2018, emissions, as we noted in the previous slide, had gone down, but because transportation hadn't changed at all, the transportation emissions were now 45% of the total. Residential, commercial, and industrial had grown to be 38%. Agricultural and waste were almost the same at 4%. The electric generation sector had fallen from 35% to 13%, a significant drop. And now, we also, this slide is just showing that it's important to focus on transportation because that is actually where most of our greenhouse gas emissions come from, but it's also where we are seeing most of the criteria air pollutants, the ozone precursors like nitrous oxide come from. So this data was from an inventory in 2014 that New Hampshire DES did, but it showed that mobile source emissions were, for non-greenhouse gases, were representative of almost 60% of, and mobile sources is the transportation sector. whereas fossil fuel combustion in the industrial and electric utilities was just 26%. So very often, there's a lot of attention paid to electric generation in the state as a source of pollutants. It turns out the transportation sector and the building sector are responsible for far more greenhouse gas emissions, as well as more criteria air pollutants. So the purpose of these slides and this presentation in general is that by broadening our view beyond the electric sector, we may be able to find areas and programs that we can prioritize in order to benefit the local health, as well as our direct contribution to greenhouse gases. I realize there are questions. I'm going to just have to keep going because there are 10 more slides that I want to get to, and then we can have a conversation. So this next one shows that since 2005 to 2018, it just emphasizes the level of change that has not happened in in each of the different sectors. That most of the change that we have seen in terms of greenhouse gas emission reductions has been in the electric sector. And what did this one mean? If we look at where most of the emissions are coming from, we can also then begin to break it down into like which fuels are contributing the most in terms of pollution. The transportation sector, most of it's coming from motor gasoline because so many vehicles do run on gas. Diesel fuel is also used primarily by long-haul trucks and a few smaller vehicles. Jet fuel is the few airplanes that we do have flying out of Manchester and our other airports. In the residential sector, we're seeing primarily heating fuel contributing to our greenhouse gas emissions, as well as propane. Natural gas, because of limited distribution of the natural gas network, emits far less. And kerosene is used by a smaller portion of the population that needs to utilize that because of the location of their fuel tanks. But this kind of helps us identify where we might be seeing opportunities to target for reductions in fuel consumption. That fuel consumption is linked to greenhouse gas emissions, but then it's also linked to criteria air pollutants. Commercial emissions and industrial emissions show very similar things in terms of all of the emissions are coming from fossil fuel consumption. The change here is that they rely more heavily on natural gas. Natural gas does emit less criteria air pollutants than oil, coal, kerosene, but it still does emit greenhouse gases. Motor gasoline and fuel oil or distillate oil represent a smaller portion of the total emissions. When we step back and don't get as granular, we can see that the trend in New Hampshire's total energy consumption, so I've now switched from greenhouse gas emissions to energy consumption. We can see that the New Hampshire energy system has not really changed how much energy that it is consumed since it peaked in 2004. It did dip down between 2004 and 2011, but since 2011, it has rebounded and is nearly at the same point that it was at its peak. So while our total emissions have gone down, our total energy consumption has not really changed. Our economy got more, could be said it got more efficient, but it was actually because the economy as a whole contracted in its energy consumption due to economic reasons rather than policy reasons. So how did we see such a significant reduction in greenhouse gas emissions? It comes about because of changes in the electric sector. And so what this shows is overall electric generation changes. This isn't energy consumption. This isn't greenhouse gas emissions. This is just what our generators were doing in the state. And the electric generators in New Hampshire feed the regional grid rather than just New Hampshire. If we were to take the entire set of electrons that are generated by our electric generation fleet, almost half are exported out onto the state or shared with the other state, might be another states in the region. So the 6 New England states. We can see that since it started in 1992, nuclear has represented most of the electricity that has been generated. Coal, which is the dark blue, represented a significant amount, but since 2004, it has gone down considerably. What it was replaced by was red. Natural gas went from being almost nothing out to 2002, and then 2 gas plants were opened in the state, and it has seemingly displaced coal almost entirely. And so while there is a lot of attention paid to one coal facility, it actually represents a tiny, tiny fraction of the total electric generation in the state and the total emissions. At a localized standpoint, that can be significant, but from a state perspective, most of our energy generation is coming from other sources. If we look at overall generation changes, this flips it to look at greenhouse gas emissions. And this data is updated through yesterday. I took some data down off the Reggie Coates website, which catalogs all of the data provided by each of the different generators that are covered by Reggie. What you can see is that for emitting sources in New Hampshire that fall under Reggie, and that's 2 gas plants, and then there's an oil and residual oil generator, and then 1 coal plant. For half the time that we were here, or this chart shows data, the coal plant was responsible for most of the greenhouse gas emissions in the state. But around 2006, things began to change, and then it dramatically tailed off so that now it's just a very small fraction, and the natural gas plant is responsible for almost all the emissions. You can see that the gas facility, or even the oil emissions, have dropped. That's the dark green, and it also just runs very intermittently. So most of our emissions in the electric sector right now are much more consistent, but they're all coming from gas. So our emissions have fallen in the electric sector by 90%. And that is reductions in the coal, or since 2005, fallen by 90%. And that's reductions in coal and reductions in the oil generation. So that the remaining generation is largely just gas. So how did that happen? It's, again, because we are part of a regional grid, and we are part of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. Now, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative is a market-based program where generators have to buy allowances for each ton of CO2 that is emitted into the atmosphere. It has grown from its original number of states to include, I think since this slide was put together, Pennsylvania's been added. I think Virginia's been added as well. Each of the generation facilities purchases allowances for auctions, and then those allowances, the funding from those auctions is used in states to fund energy efficiency, renewable energy programs that then reduce the need for more fossil fuel generation. So the program is intended to lower the amount of greenhouse gas emissions in the electric sector over time. It would seem it's done great things for New Hampshire. However, a lot of what we have seen in New England, so this changes, this shows the mix of where our generation in New England comes from. I apologize, it changes along the bottom, it shows the years. Along the side, it shows the percent of each type of generation to the total of the electric generation in New England. On top, it shows that natural gas has gone in 2000 from 13% to 40% in 2019. It shows that nuclear went from 27% to 25%. It shows that we've imported roughly the same amount in 2000 as we do today. It shows that renewables have grown from 6% to just 9%. Hydro has not grown that much, but coal has gone from 15% down to 0.4%, and oil has gone from 19% down to 0.1%. The change, the inflection point, happened prior to RGGI starting on January 1st of 2009. So something was happening in addition to the RGGI program that was making it more expensive for fossil fuel generators to run. If we look at a different chart, we can actually see that New England was consuming slightly less electricity. The green bars show the total amount of electricity that was being consumed. No, the total system demand for its all-time high in each of the different years. So even though we had more people in the state, more people had air conditioning, we weren't necessarily seeing the regional spike in electricity on the hottest or highest demand portion of the day. We also, if you look at the line with the circles, you can see that in 2005, that was the highest year for total energy consumption in New England. And that after 2005 out to 2019, total energy consumption in all of New England was falling, even before the RGGI program started. So what has been influencing some of New Hampshire's emissions reductions is the RGGI program, but it's also a reduction in overall energy consumption in New England. And as coal was being priced out by natural gas, as there's less demand for electricity, there's less demand for the coal facility to run. So we see actually Bow and the oil facility, because they're more expensive to generate electricity, they're running less and less to the point that they're almost completely off, except for periods of very high demand when they need to run because we're short on natural gas. Oh. Now, how did we get here? According to ISO New England, this is an update that is now available online. It's the most recent power profile for the state or for the region. If you look at New England and you zero in on our energy efficiency rankings, you can see that Massachusetts, Maine, Vermont, Rhode Island, and Connecticut are all in the top 10 for energy efficiency in the nation. Very often, Massachusetts is ranked number 1, and its ranking switches with California. They kind of depends on the year which one's ranked 1, but the other New England states are always all in the top 10, almost always all in the top 10. Maine has accelerated out and into the top 10 and is solidly there this year. New Hampshire oscillates between being like 18th, 19th, and then into the top 20. We are always on the far outside of New England in terms of our energy efficiency. So we have the lowest or weakest energy efficiency programs in the state. In addition, we also have the least amount of ambition when it comes to renewable energy. So all the other states are pushing for greater than 40% of their power by 2040 to come from renewable energy sources. Connecticut is the only state that's really kind of like below 50%. So there's a lot of ambition in the states around us. And because we share in that power pool, the more efficient we become, the more generation we get from clean energy sources, the less demand there is for New Hampshire's fossil fuel generators. And so that's the reason why our fossil fuel emissions have fallen by as much as 70% in the electric sector, but they remain unchanged in the other sectors, residential, commercial, industrial, and transportation, because the regional policies have no influence on our total economy energy consumption. And what this looks at is if we just look at our total retail electric sales, we can see that between 1990 and 2005, this is I apologize for this diagram. It's interesting in that it basically just shows that New Hampshire's energy consumption for retail electric energy consumption has grown between 1990 and 2005, but since 2005, it's only fallen by 2%. For all the other states, their energy consumption went up, but they're between 1990 and 2005, that's the light blue line. But since 2005 and today, their energy consumption is 3 times greater than ours or more. Maine's a little bit behind us in this data because it's out of date. So looking ahead to the future, as of 2017, we were not expected to see any further significant reductions in the electric sector because there's not that much further for us to go. The black line shows what was expected for New Hampshire out to 2030, and this data only goes to 2019, but we were slightly ahead of where Reggie modeling was putting us, primarily because we needed more our natural gas generators to run more than was expected. But you can see that there's not a lot of like opportunity for us to get our electric generation down. When we look at the transportation sector, the last time there were projections for New Hampshire done, this is the black line, it showed that out to 2030, we were not expected to see any further reductions in energy consumption or greenhouse gas emissions in the transportation sector. And in fact, when we compared the transportation emissions and energy consumption to that model, years after the 2014 modeling had been done, we were actually exceeding the energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions. So New Hampshire is actually doing worse when we look forward. We see the same thing for the residential sector. And then when we look at the entire economy, the dotted line shows that image that I showed before. It's the goals that have been set for the climate action plan, showing a reduction, between 2025 and 2050, where we needed to get to get to an 80% reduction by 2050. When we looked at the red line, that shows the modeling for what the economy expected that we would have for emissions out to 2030. When the modeling was done in 2014, the last time statewide modeling was done with a forecast for the 2014 energy strategy. Unfortunately, when we compare our energy consumption today and our greenhouse gas emissions for the last time that they were published, the black line in 2018, we were actually exceeding that modeling. So we were above what we were projected to be at as far back in 2014. So the economy is not performing as well as it should. The electric sector's seen a big drop, but the other sectors have continued to consume more energy than was anticipated. So this is an accidental repeat. So what I wanted to note is that a lot of this reduction, a lot of focus has been put on the fact that New Hampshire is not included among the greenhouse gas targets in New England. There's 5 very clear statutory targets that have been established for the other states, but they have made significant gains even in the absence of these goals. These goals, have begun to kick in 2008 and after, and so they have begun to accelerate the ambition and the policies that are seen in those states. But New England had already started to see reductions in greenhouse gas emissions before these policies were set and really went into effect. And that's because those states had largely prioritized building efficiency, clean energy generation, and then had started to focus on strategic electrification. An example of strategic electrification is that the state of Maine had prioritized installing 100,000 heat pumps, I think by 2030. They've already hit that target. And that target was set at the same time that they were establishing a goal for their greenhouse gas emissions. So what we're seeing is, and I'm going to stop now because I've thrown way too much at you, is that there's a lot of focus on the electric sector. The electric sector in New England and New Hampshire has already experienced a significant amount of greenhouse gas emission reduction. And with it, we have seen a significant improvement in air quality resulting from, or at least from a statewide and region-wide scale, local notwithstanding, improvements in air quality. Where we have not seen improvements is statewide or local when we look at the transportation sector and the building sector. Other states have, even though, and it's not a result just of their goals, it's a result of the programs and other smaller supporting policies that they have put into place. And so the point of this is when we're thinking about the Priority Climate Action Plan, are there other opportunities outside the electric sector that we might be able to focus on that are going to result in greater reductions in greenhouse gases, but also result in greater reductions in the remaining criteria air pollutants that result from fossil fuel consumption. All right, that was an incredible, insane fire hose. That presentation should have been closer to an hour or an hour and 15 minutes. And
Chris, that was fabulous, though. That was really great. And I'm sure we've got a number of people sort of
yeah,
keeping up with questions. I know Sherry's had her hand up for a while.
I will stop.
And I love what you just teed up in terms of what what kinds of discussions might be useful for us to have or probe. And so I invite people to probe those. But and I'm sorry, you've taken your hand down now and I've forgotten your name. So if
It
somebody
was
would,
Sherry Boschert.
Sherry?
Yeah, I'm sorry, that was just a glitch. I clicked
Oh,
wrong.
okay.
Carry
All
on.
right, then. And then Bruce, I see you just raised your hand.
Yeah, I have a question, if I can ask it now. So Chris, when I look at the graph, it seems like most of our energy savings are due to nuclear. And I'm not totally up to date on this, but Seabrook's lifespan is coming to an end, is it not?
So let me make sure that I stopped sharing, right?
Yep.
Okay. Give me 1 second. So my understanding is that its original lifespan had been for like 2030, but it has gotten an extension, and it is not so much an energy reduction or energy efficiency. It is categorized as clean energy because it's non-emitting. So when we look at the greenhouse gas inventory, it doesn't show up because the emissions occur from, mining and processing of uranium in another state. When the generation occurs here, it does have impacts on the effluent hot water that's pumped out to sea. I grew up in Hampton Falls, so I'm very familiar with it. But as my understanding is, it has been relicensed, but it is also a regional generator, and as are all of our assets. If New Hampshire were to turn off its electric consumption, every single one of us were to turn off our lights, turn off our hot water, our dishwashers and stoves, and we went 100%, electric free, our generators would still be serving the region. Other generators might be turning off. And
I'm just pushing back a little bit because I think all of us are interested in legislation that's going to be helpful.
Yeah.
And so I'm looking at these graphs saying, I don't see the problem. New Hampshire's doing well. And nuclear power is clean energy, and we just got an expansion. And so I don't see the crisis here for New Hampshire. Right? I'm just playing devil's advocate here.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that I would say is that even if you don't care about greenhouse gas emissions, our energy consumption has not changed. And therefore, from an economic standpoint, we are spending just as much, if not more, than we did in years prior, because we are still paying to import very volatile costing energy supplies. So things like energy efficiency, strategic electrification that is actually reducing energy, even if it's using electricity versus another fuel, those have an economic benefit. There's a whole type of analysis that we could bring to bear on this that I did not have time to do and have not had time in the past, that I'm not sure that anyone else has, in terms of how much money do we spend on any given year and how much have we foregone by avoiding clean energy policies. Back in 2011 and 2012, when we did an investigation into energy policy studies, it was estimated that we were exporting between $4.6 and $5 billion a year to import fossil fuels into the state. And that number likely has gone up considerably. And so other states, as they've gotten more efficient, are keeping those dollars in and strengthening their economy. New Hampshire has a strong economy. Perhaps we could have a much stronger one.
So Chris, we've got a very direct question in the chat from Paul Friedrichs, which is, what are your recommendations for the 2024 New Hampshire Climate Action Plan?
So this is where I'm hesitant to say, I'm actually more curious in terms of what are you all seeing that I and other people that just sit and do this and think about this, I've already been through 3 climate planning processes. I'm naturally biased because I've been trained to think one way. So I think what the question is, does the Energy Committee, would they be served to meet in the short term and begin to think about what are programs that should be recommended to DES, because applications are due for funding from the EPA, I think, at the beginning of April. The turnaround time is insanely short. So the already climate action plan, and if anyone wants to correct me, is really focused on programs that can be fundable. They're not focused on legislative targets. They're not focused on statutory goals. It's instead, what can we apply to the EPA and get more money to complement what's already coming in from the IIJA and the IRA. So personally, you know, the one thing that I throw out as an example is we should get as many like heat pumps into low income, moderate income households as possible, and then, you know, but be maximizing the efficiency of those buildings at the same time. Like, that's just my bias, because I feel like that would target an area where it would have an equity benefit, and it would have an emissions benefit and an energy benefit. So looking for like, where can we find a sweet spot like that? Rather than target electric generation, we start, and then where might we also look for unfunded areas for transportation? There's a lot of money coming in with the IIJA and the IRA, but are there other areas that possibly aren't?
Thanks very much, Chris. And I'm just going to ask everybody to sort of keep their questions short. And Chris, also you, we've got 6 minutes left for those of us who need to leave at the hour. And Paul Bemis, you've been very generous waiting, and we've got a couple other questions queued up. And you want to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I did. So Chris, to your point, I'm the president of Granite State ASHRAE, and ASHRAE is all about decarbonization in the built sector, okay? So you're pointing out some very important factors here. Greenhouse gas emission is predominantly commercial and residential building. We're burning oil, we're burning gas. So decarbonization is really key. We need a program there. Second one, you talk a lot about energy, about air quality, but you're talking about outdoor air quality. Indoor air quality is as important, and we just went through a pandemic. Airborne transmission of pathogens is a huge issue, which brings me to the point of insulation and making these buildings more energy efficient. Now, when you do that, you tend to tighten them up. When you tighten them up, you have worse indoor air quality. So therefore, it needs to be done in a way that provides good indoor air quality through energy recovery ventilation. This is all very well understood, but I don't see any programs in our state focused on this topic. It seems to be a little bit haphazard. We have an insulation program here and a weatherization program here. It would help to bring those together in a cohesive way and drive this point hard. It's the biggest opportunity to win, for exactly the reasons you point out. It improves homeowner equity, it reduces energy footprint, and it reduces greenhouse gas emission and improves indoor air quality. All of those things at once.
So I would 100% agree, and I will answer it only by saying, if anyone wants to talk about the fact that we will not be moving ahead with the most efficient energy code this session because of home builder and contractor pushback this session, happy to have that discussion. That is a legislative issue that probably is not appropriate for the PCAP.
And should be pushed on really, really hard right now. First cost is not the issue. It's cost of ownership over time. You know this, we all know this. People pushing first cost and upfront cost associated with this is an issue. I'd love to work with you on that point.
Sure.
Thanks. Great topic. Haley, I've got you next.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Chris. I'm excited to share it with my team. I'm going to come at this from a slightly different angle as a community organizer. Thinking about our legislators and our regulators, where are you seeing good pressure points for people to take action at a local level? Is it working on local energy, local climate plans? What would you say?
Yeah, so where I've seen, okay, so one of the things, I was one of the founders of the Local Energy Solutions Working Group back in 2007. And one of the reasons why that is the most effective place to work in New Hampshire is because the state legislature is at an impasse. And so working at the local level has had a significant benefit, because if municipalities go and ask for assistance in policies that will help the municipality become more efficient or use more renewables or buy more EVs, because they represent taxpayers, municipalities actually have a different voice than Clean Energy New Hampshire, has a different voice than anyone else. If I can get a town to come and speak on our behalf, or an energy committee to come and speak on our behalf about the benefit of a policy that carries far more weight with legislators because towns represent taxpayers and taxpayers are ratepayers. And it's not a company coming asking for a handout. It's not a special interest tree hugging dirt worshiper, which I completely identify with, asking for help. It's the common people. Municipalities are really good cover for that. So there's local energy committees can work on projects like, Paul mentioned, but they can also advocate at the state level. And that's partly how we got CPCNH created, or community power aggregation. It's because it was deemed as a benefit for the municipalities and the taxpayers because it cuts costs for everyone. And so it's kind of figuring out what is an argument that works for legislators in New Hampshire that are kind of purple.
Great, thanks. Em, you're up next.
Wanted to kind of confirm out of all of that data, what trends we might be seeing in a couple sentence summary. And I feel like what we're viewing is that really the carbon emissions in New Hampshire are coming out of our transportation and our built structure. And I thank Paul for that question earlier. So it sounds like, we also really need to think about how we can get carbon emissions out of our transportation sector to really achieve the progress that we seek in New Hampshire. And then, going back to that question of electricity, we have seen this big shift in the last couple decades away from coal to nuclear and to natural gas. And so going into the future, I think the question becomes, as we strategically electrify the residential sector or the built environment and transportation, we're going to have this big new electric demand. And so then the question becomes, how are we filling that? And is it through more natural gas? Is it through nuclear? Is it through other options? And I just wanted to kind of see if high level, that's essentially the policy questions that we're trying to get at. How do we decarbonize transportation? Because we've already talked about the built structure. And then how do we build out the energy sector to support all of these transitions into the future?
So Emma's just like tripped into like what I think is actually like, it's not, you can't just look at any one thing. We need to look at them all. And any energy modeling that I've seen from national groups, regional groups, I'm happy to share some of the modeling that I've seen that's really interesting. There's presentations that were actually done at the LES conference 2 years ago. But one of them says that, or notes that if we do strategic electrification, which is where we transition away more towards electric vehicles, knowing that not all vehicles can be electric. If we get more homes electrified through heat pumps, making sure we've got HRVs and good ventilation so we don't tighten a house and suffocate everybody. To Paul's point, we will actually see a drop in the economy's energy consumption that might be like we use half of the total energy that we consume today. We could see a doubling or quadrupling of the amount of electricity that we consume. And so the challenge is, how do we make one go up in terms of the buildings and the cars become more efficient, less emitting, while not bringing online new fossil assets? So how do we begin to kind of like stack the deck? And so some of the challenges to get past the PCAP and the longer plan is, how do we come up with a development plan that both is integrated into New England for where do we put resources? Like, we're not going to have a whole lot of wind on top of mountains because that just hasn't been politically palatable. But where in other places in New England can we site offshore wind? How do we make the best use of the gas assets that we have? Because even if gas runs, I know it's not great, but a heat pump running on gas and a car running off gas generated electricity is still less fossil fuels, less greenhouse gas emissions, possibly less fracked, byproducts in other states. And we just run them as little as possible by maximizing energy efficiency in all other parts of the grid, and then figuring out how do we bring on board storage so that we can take advantage of days when it's really sunny, days when it's really windy. And then over time, gas becomes kind of like Bow is now, where it runs during moments of desperation. We keep them online because if the grid goes down, everyone's going to blame renewables. They're not going to blame gas. Like think about in Texas during Hurricane Uri, the wind turbines were blowing and it was the gas plants that froze. Everyone blamed the wind turbines. So there does need to be some kind of like chess level planning that looks at how do all the sectors move together. And I think one of the harder questions is where are we going to put the ugly infrastructure and transmission for distribution networks? How are we going to cite that so it is equity and environmental sustainability that are built in? The energy system, I think, is going to become more apparent to us. A lot of it's hidden away in other states now with gas fracking and gas lines. As we become more electric, there's a good chance we'll see a lot more poles and wires to help us decarbonize. But that means that we're going to have to carry some of the infrastructure here in the state. But I think this is where one of the things that we need to be advocating for is maybe not solutions, but how do we host, well-facilitated long-term plans in the state like we did back in 2007, 2008, 2009. And then there was two planning cycle after that, but they were statewide in nature. And they were supported by third-party consultants that did a lot of the economic and energy analysis.
Chris, I'm going to jump in if I may.
Yeah.
So it's a little after 5. Chris said he'd stay on to answer questions, but I want to do a couple little PR messages for the network, if I may. So we're at New Hampshire Network. Everyone sees that. And we want to let you know that a month from now, we're going to have a workshop on funding sources, municipalities, businesses, nonprofits, what's out there, how do you find out? So we'll be sending you information on that. February 12th, Plastic Working Group will be talking about global and local solutions to the plastic crisis. They've been around for 3 years and they have an international reputation. So they're pretty powerful and proud of themselves and got some great new things going locally and globally. So that's a presentation February 12th. We have working groups we hope that you might consider joining us for. Legislation and policy, that's what's sponsoring this evening's meeting, but there'll be another one January 12th at 4 o'clock, talking about what's happening at the State House and how we can lean not just on our legislators, but also the PUC, DES, DOE. Where are the good inflection points? Also, starting a municipal energy committee. Paul, January 18th at 4, do I have that right?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, super. So that's for all the people that are on energy committees, to learn how you can do more in your locality to make things happen. And especially you'll have a chance to learn from Paul about the built structures. The Plastics Working Group has a meeting this Sunday at 6. And a lot of that will be based on what's up at the legislature, PFAS, extended producer responsibility, single-use plastic, a lot's going on. Brand new, or almost brand new, climate, February 7th, and John Gage is next in line for a question. That means that.
Can I make a correction? That's actually January 10th. We've moved our
Oops.
meeting to the second Wednesday of every month. So it's next week on Wednesday.
Thank you. Thanks. Oh, January. Got it. Okay, January 10th, 7 p.m. And then truly a new group, Environment. Rob's on this call, and it will be starting January 19th at 6. We'll be sending out notices, but just want to let you know. So those are ways to be involved on helping with the climate. We'll be updating our legislative spreadsheet weekly. I know Clean Energy New Hampshire is just putting up theirs now. So that's a way to learn about current bills and actually to weigh in. And we're all trying to get it out to you by the weekend so that you're ready with your testimony come Monday morning when lots of legislatures heard. And then finally, this is a ridiculously long address for the climate action plan. I could not find anything shorter. But Mr. Tilley, you mentioned, and someone else, you can just email to find out this information, right? CP, someone chime in?
Yeah, so this is James Tilley, New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services. If you want to send comments about the Priority Climate Action Plan, you can send it to that email address, cprg@des.nh.gov. I will also right now put links to our website in the chat, and links to EPA's website for the CPRG. Sorry that information is not getting out there, but I'll get it to this group.
Okay, and we will be sending out the recording and whatever slides Chris wants to share and the chat and those links. And that's it for me. And Chris, you can keep going for as long as you want. Oh, I need you to stop share. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, I have until my daughter comes in here and says it's time to leave for hockey. So my question is, does anyone have anything that they want to say about, actually, I have a question. Susan, do you have 1 minute to define what is the difference between energy group, climate group, and the environment group? Or is there some intentional opportunities for overlap?
The energy group grew out of the fact that we used to call it the legislation group, and it focused mostly on energy. And we realized that we didn't have the plastic group define themselves as not energy. And so we decided that we need to think specifically about mostly bills coming out of the STE and its sort of parallel group in the Senate, energy, natural, I forget which one it's
Energy
called.
and natural resources.
Right. But so really about the renewable portfolio standards, RGGI, REX, all those things that really have to do with how energy gets to us. But none of the guidelines are really clear. I think environment, Rob, you want to say a word or two about environment, and John, a word or two about climate and how you see yourselves as different from us?
Sure. My understanding. Hi, everyone. I'm Rob Pinson. I'm in Nashua. Just to quickly introduce myself. And my understanding in being tapped to sort of stand up this working group is that environment as a principle has been part of the New Hampshire network from the get-go. I mean, it's right there in the logo. But there hasn't been a working group that talks about some of actually what you mentioned, which are the overlaps. And one of the ways that we are hoping to be able to, one of the things that we're going to be focusing most on in this new working group is that of environmental justice specifically. And sort of combining that with environmental health as well as economics. So that's meant to be the distinction here. It's more of a broad-based working group. And as you are well aware, we are severely lacking on the EJ front here in New Hampshire. We're the last New England state without something along the lines of an EJ statute. So of some variety. So that's what, that's essentially what that boils down to.
But all of our working groups pretty much are what the members want them to be. And I'm sure that the initial meeting will say that. And we're still figuring out, like, are we making sure that we're talking enough about waste and what's happening up in Dalton Lake and, in Casella, insisting that they get to dump whatever they want to dump there. So there's lots of issues that deserve attention. And if people are interested in following them, we're interested in hearing what your ideas are, we collectively. Okay, and John, climate is?
Yeah, so for climate, I co-lead this with Reinmar Siedler, and we have a couple objectives. One is to connect the organizations across New Hampshire that are working on some aspect of climate, so we can help amplify each other's efforts instead of lots of boats in the water, everybody paddling toward the same direction, but not working together. A lot of the things we want are shared goals. And so League of Conservation Voters and 350 and Citizens Climate Lobby and all the other smaller climate groups in the state, we feel they just need to communicate more with each other so that when there's a bill in a state committee hearing, we all know what it is, and we can represent different groups in testimonies as opposed to one group, being focused on it, wishing that there was more support showing up for it. And so climate, definitely there's overlap Most of us go to the one or two of the other working group meetings also. But we focus on greenhouse gas reduction, not so much dry down from the air. But a lot of it is related to electricity, transportation, building efficiency, and coming from a CCL perspective, we believe a federal carbon price is necessary to address climate change. So trying to educate other climate groups within New Hampshire about the power of carbon pricing and how the state, by preparing for a federal price, can do all of the things that all of the climate groups in New Hampshire want to see done. Anyway, that's, I guess, there's a lot of overlap, but we do have focused areas. And as far as the legislative working group, now each working group comes up with a list of bills that we want to track, and we do that together on the New Hampshire Bills webpage on our New Hampshire Network website.
I'd like to butt in again. The plastic working group has a number of people that have actually been very active in talking to, struggling with the DES about protecting air quality in terms of advanced recycling facilities and expanded landfill permits, such as the one in Rochester. So there are people thinking about air quality in the more classic sense that are in the plastics group. And hopefully at some point we can do more with regenerative carbon capture, as opposed to all these Star Wars expensive plans that people hope to make money on their technology. But regenerative agriculture, composting, those are big ways to pull down emissions too, and that we simply haven't had people that have championed them. But come to meetings and talk them up if you've got ideas about them. Okay, Meredith, your hand was up. Did you want to say something?
Oh, thanks, Susan. I'm barraging James with questions in the chat. I think it's great that there's a an email address where we could all send comments. But I would love to have DES give us some parameters, like, Manchester is ready to weatherize schools, or, Nashua is ready to do net zero manufactured homes, or, are they looking for shovel ready projects, which is kind of what I've been hearing, because as Chris said, the EPA grants are due April 1. And if we are all submitting, sort of the goals that the state doesn't have as our comments, is that at all useful? Doesn't mean we shouldn't all say New Hampshire should be working toward net zero by 2050. Like, we should all be saying that, but is that actually going to be a useful comment to DES in the document they need to submit on March 1st? I would prefer to give comments that are useful.
So to answer your question, and thank you for your question, Meredith, I appreciate it. And I apologize the word hasn't gotten out as much as it should have. We have worked with New Hampshire Listens to try to get the word out. But basically, as you mentioned, our priority climate action plan is due to EPA by March 1st. And that plan is supposed to include New Hampshire's priority measures that open the door for the implementation grants. Now, it's my understanding different states are taking different approaches with their priority climate action plan. Currently, we're being relatively general. We're not required to name projects by location or name or by implementing entity. And so, for example, we could have a measure in our plan on incentives for installing heat pumps. And without going into details, it would cover any eligible applicant in New Hampshire and any coalition partner that a New Hampshire eligible applicant would partner with. And so once that PCAP is in, if it has that heat pump measure, for example, then any New Hampshire municipality can apply for the competitive grant. And so that a New Hampshire municipality is any governmental entity formed under state law. So that includes towns, cities, districts, including school districts, water districts, regional planning commissions, entities like that. And so our goal with the plan is to open the door for all those applications. There's a limit of one application per entity. So for example, DES can only submit one application on its own. It can submit another as a coalition with a group of entities as a lead. And that's also true at the municipal level. So for example, the city of Manchester can submit one application on its own and one as a lead of a coalition. And then the range, EPA has about 4.3 billion that it expects to provide funding for in these grants, but they only expect to provide about 115 grants out of that. So when you divide that by 50 states, and you know, you're looking at New Hampshire, which is a relatively small state. The way I look at it, historically in these big federal programs, New Hampshire, Region 1, which is basically New England, typically gets about 10% of the money. And then New Hampshire typically gets about 1% of that. So in the back of my mind, I'm thinking about $43 million for New Hampshire if we do everything correctly, submit a good priority climate action plan, and we have good applications that come in. And then EPA is looking at different tiers of funding levels, and the lowest tier is $2 million to $10 million. So I hope that generally answers your question.
Super helpful. Thank you so much.
Okay, and John Gage had a question.
Thank you, Chris. To Chris, I just bought an EV and I tried to drive 100 miles up Route 93 to do some winter hiking and drive back. And although my car said it had 300 miles of range, it took 180 miles of range to get up 100 miles because I was going uphill and it was cold. And I don't have a Tesla, so I checked to see where the rapid chargers are on Route 93 North, and there really aren't any if you're not in a Tesla. So transportation is the topic, and it's the leading cause of New Hampshire's greenhouse gases. You know, we need a lot more rapid chargers on main routes, and we need a lot more people in EVs. Can you offer suggestions at the state level that we could ask for those in our climate plan?
So really quick, I can show you, I don't know if you guys can see this. This is actually a slide that shows the coming EVs to New England as projected by ISO New England. And one thing that it shows in New Hampshire, we are expected to have one of the lowest levels of EV adoption in the region, just ahead of Vermont, which has about a third of the population that we have. And so we do have funding that's coming into DOT. They've got a funding round that's about to close, or application round that's about to close. And it is primarily targeting our alternative fuel vehicle corridor, which includes 93, 89, 101, 95. And there we're looking to put in the minimum requirement for the feds is it has to have 4 plugs, 150 kilowatt available charging. The goal is that nationwide there would be a network that would allow you or anyone else that has level 3 access to move throughout the country and have adequate charging so that you can get from one location to another without running out. We will need far more than that. And the travel and tourism industry has actually embraced this because they look at this data and it shows that we will, by 2032, have almost 3 or 2.5 million EVs on the road in New England. Most of those will be in Massachusetts, and 50% of our skiers and travelers and other travelers come from Massachusetts. More travelers and tourists come from Mass than they come from New Hampshire. So even if we don't take care of New Hampshire drivers, we need to be prepared for the energy transition that's occurring in the states around us. So this is where economics and energy and economic development overlap. And so that change is coming. The Department of Transportation has also applied for additional funding. And then the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services applied for a companion grant that would then put community chargers, so more level 2 chargers within the communities where people might travel to, even in your home communities. Those chargers would benefit not only the travelers, but it would also benefit residents that might live in a home where they can't upgrade their electrical service to put in a level 2 charger like I can, or they live in an apartment where the landlords are not yet ready to put chargers on location. We saw a lot of resistance to that in the last legislative session. So there's a lot of federal money coming this way. It's probably not enough to get us to where we need to be. And so there have been, there's a study, Senate Bill 52, which hopefully will pick up in the summer, but it provides an opportunity for people to weigh in and say the state should be supplying additional support that would allow the free market to invest private capital into this, because buying EVs is actually the easy part. Finding adequate charging outside of your home, that's more difficult. And I have gone through the same trip you have, where I made it to Littleton on 75% of my charge. Fortunately, I just rolled downhill to my house.
Yeah. So BIA has mentioned that is one of the things that makes it hard for them to get employees. So maybe they will weigh heavily on their need for more chargers so that businesses can get the employees they want. Paul, I know your hand's up, but John Tuttle was asking, as long as we're on transportation, about rail or public transportation, anything going on there?
So rail was a big piece of the New Hampshire Climate Action Plan in 2007 through 2009. The challenge that we have continued to see from the legislature and from the governor is a hesitance for the government to get involved in rail, because rail requires a heavy government involvement in terms of helping to get it started. And so I think it comes into conflict with that small government bias that is very strong in Concord right now. One of the things that has been recommended, though, is that if we can help freight rail, then freight rail can take that might be a way to get more passenger rail, because freight rail actually can help cover the costs of the rails. I guess I don't want to spend too much time. It's complicated, but like, you need to move one thing to move another thing to move another thing. It does require, I think, a lot of public engagement and support for it to help get over the thaw that we've seen almost that's been more than a decade in Concord. Like, we've seen the executive council reject federal funds to even study the issue.
Okay, and Paul's been patient.
Chris, I just wanted to pick up, if you've got a little time, and talk to me about adopting new energy codes for buildings in New Hampshire. This has come up a number of times, and I'm just curious about your take on what we need to do to improve the energy efficiency of these homes via code and other means.
I've been involved in the energy code since 2015. And candidly, I have seen an appetite for the most modern energy code to be adopted in every instance, except from the building community. Part of it is because they don't, and I guess I'm being charitable by leaving out this part, they claim that no one wants this, that if people want energy efficient homes, they can ask for it and then they will build to that spec. Most homes are not necessarily built that way. Most people don't know to ask for these energy codes, but they're also claiming that it impacts the affordability of homes, and we already have an affordable housing crisis in the state. And so there are contractors that are on the Building Code Review Board that are advocating against this. And it doesn't necessarily affect all builders, but it definitely helps builders that, you know, just are trying to build as fast as possible. I understand that there are supply costs, like the energy, no, supply chain issues are a cost. But right now there is a lot of willingness to buy the fact that building code energy codes increase costs, which makes it harder to build homes, which increases or which impacts the housing affordability and the even the building supply. And in a year when housing affordability is supposed to be big at the legislature, I can see a lot of appetite for continuing to disregard building or adopting the most modern energy code. And even if it were to come forward in a separate bill, the governor would he'd find it easy to veto and use the message of limiting government regulation in the name of affordability. Because the problem is the people that are building and the people that are financing aren't the people paying the energy costs. They're not paying for that life cycle costs. And so even when we've seen an overwhelming number of people come in and say, this is what we want, at the Building Code Review Board, they actually shut down the 2021 code from being adopted because they came in and brought forward 54 amendments to the code at the last possible moment, so that the Building Code Review Board was faced with, we either don't move forward with the code, we table the building energy code and hold it at 2018, or we have to put the entire code adoption process on hold for a year while we work through 54 amendments that were brought forward in like June, as opposed to June of 2021 when they started the review. It was a very deliberate and cynical act in my view.
That's really frustrating.
But I think this is, unless there is an outpouring of support for the building energy code to be moved from 2018 to 2021, this legislature strikes me as one which would be willing to take the short-term hurt, the hurt of lower performing energy buildings, if it has any measure of or chance of getting more housing supply. Because right now we've got like what, a 0.5% vacancy rate for rentals in the state. It's the lowest in this in New England by tenfold. And when we're looking at problems about we can't find people that want to move to the state because of EVs, well, if they move here because they can find charging, they still can't find a house to live in. So we've got a workforce crisis like looming on our hands. And so the building energy code seems like an easy sacrifice.
Well, I look forward to
we can't
working
win.
I look forward to working with you on that.
Yeah.
On that topic.
Yeah, honestly, I just need someone who can help carry the water, because I think most people have given up for this year that have been traditionally involved.
Well, I'm helping with this energy subcommittee here, where the municipalities can work together, and hopefully that can provide some leverage, somewhat of a hammer to help you get these issues. Because if you look at your data, and I'm very familiar with your data, the built industry is the largest. It's bigger than transportation when you sum them. When you sum the commercial, residential sectors together, industrial sectors together, you have greenhouse gas emission that exceeds transportation. This is well known. It's true all over the world. So we have to get after it. And the simplest thing to do is new projects have to be done to a certain level of energy efficiency, and the existing stock that we have has to be brought up to a certain level of efficiency. It just has to be. That's the only way out of this thing, is to make these buildings more energy efficient. And you do that by old ideas like insulation, weatherization. The most efficient energy is that you don't have to produce. We all know this. So we have to do it.
And I think someone mentioned in one of the comments, and if anyone is able to actually, and I have just been flagged by my hockey player that I need to go, one of the challenges is, with a lack of data, it's very easy to be gaslighted at the legislature or in any hearing room, because all someone has to say is, oh, it raises costs. The burden of proof is on everyone to prove that, oh, it doesn't raise costs, it actually saves them. And there have been numerous federal studies that have shown that while the cost to build a building goes up very marginally,
10%.
Yeah, at even if that, when you finance that over a 30-year period, you start saving after 4 months.
Yeah, cost of
Because
ownership's lower.
because you're saving so much on energy that it
That's right.
overcomes the additional finance fee that you're carrying. So
That's exactly right. And this speaks to renters as well, because your rental prices go down because, of course, the energy cost is lower. So your costs associated with renting go down too, and that's the lowest cost entry into housing is renting.
If you pay if you don't pay an
Utilities.
all-in fee, there's that whole split incentive. One of the challenges, though, is that the National Association of Home Builders has a whole array of consultants that have put together analysis that show that regulations add X number of dollars to costs, but you have to like dig through that to see what are they comparing as a base level home. Are they comparing a home that's built in zone 5A, 6B for us, zone 5 or 6 for us? I think I just actually referenced gardening, to like a home that's built in Florida that is just completely different. So of course the regulations here are very different, but you have to figure out what is their base level model. Why is it more expensive? How is it $30,000 more dollars? Because that's what is very often being put in the face of decision makers and say, if we move from this to this, it's this much more expensive. And it is, no one can carry that cost, but it's a cost that's not accurate because you're not comparing apples to oranges. You're comparing Florida to New Hampshire.
That's right.
But we have a lot of dollars that are, at national levels that are being brought to bear, just like we're facing ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council that writes bills.
Okay.
But happy to work with you. I did put my contact in. My contact is just very simple, chris@cleanenergynewhampshire.org. I do not have all the answers, but I've been in part of a lot of conversations and happy to share what data I have and harass James with all of your ideas. But thank you all for your patience and time.
Oh, Chris, thank you so much. Everyone, thank you for being here. And look forward to more of the same. And onwards and upwards.
Okay, bye now.
Thanks, Chris. Great job.
Thank you.
Have a great night and great weekend.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Bye.
Bye.
Susan, do you know how to save the chat?
Yes, I will do that.
Okay, awesome. Because I just wanted to make